And whenever we share the strategy of nullification through noncompliance and more widespread direct resistance, we share this type of information all the time. It's the strategy of the founders and the old revolutionaries. What they told us, whether it was James Iredell or Thomas Jefferson or so many people in between, this is the only way to keep government in check. We always get at least a handful of real smart guys out there. Sometimes there's a lot of them, and sometimes they're very good friends of liberty who are just repeating government propaganda. They tell everyone, don't waste your time. The feds are too powerful. They can just stop anything whenever they want, just like they did when George Washington marched in troops and crushed the Whiskey Rebellion. That was the end of this strategy. It was over. They tried it. It failed. We all know it won't work. We know they tried one more time, and then Abe Lincoln did the exact same thing. And this is wrong on at least 2 counts, if not a number of other counts. But I'm going to cover 2 main ones. One, the whiskey tax resistance wasn't crushed. In fact, it was the protesters, the resistors, who actually won in the big picture. And then 2, it was far from the end of the story. This was not just a one and done. We see a lot of examples of how this strategy was put into practice in the early years of the Republic. I will highlight a number of those as well. But I want to first start out talking about the Whiskey Rebellion. And this is a great piece by Murray Rothbard over at the Mises Institute. Of course, it'll be linked to in the show notes. Alan Mosley will get that organized, and I will get it published in the next couple of hours after the live stream is done here over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. But you should check this out. The Whiskey Rebellion, a model for our time by Murray Rothbard. And he puts it this way. The official view of the Whiskey Rebellion is that 4 counties of western Pennsylvania refused to pay an excise tax on whiskey that had been levied by a proposal of the Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, in the spring of 1791. Western Pennsylvanians failed to pay the tax, this view says, until protests, demonstrations, and some roughing up of tax collectors in western PA caused President Washington to call up a 13,000-man army in the summer and fall of 1794 to suppress the insurrection. And Rothbard sums up the official view with this: a localized but dramatic challenge to federal tax levying authority had been met and defeated. The forces of federal law and order were safe. Now, Rothbard makes it very clear that this is just the official view. It's the government propaganda view. And he says the official view turns out to be dead wrong. What a surprise that so much in history is written by the supposed winners, by the people in power. And we always get a kind of a twisted version of it. Now, I did a long episode, George Washington and the Whiskey Rebellion, over 3 years ago, where I covered not the aftermath, but some of the run-up to it and what Washington did with those troops, which is also very different than what the history books will tell us. First of all, of course, Hamilton's scammy approach to a different version of the story to each group based on what he wanted to convince them to support in order to get the tax passed in the first place, and then misrepresentations of Washington's march to suppress the physical resistance. That is going to be included in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, and I think you'll find it really, really interesting. But back to Rothbard. He just kind of rips through this whole official view. He said, the main distortion of the official view of the Whiskey Rebellion was its alleged confinement to 4 counties of western Pennsylvania. From recent research, we now know that no one paid the tax on whiskey throughout the American backcountry. That is the frontier areas of Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina, Georgia, and the entire state of Kentucky. Now, I don't know if it's a 0, but I see no indication that the whiskey tax was collected in any large numbers. In fact, it was very, very low. And in some areas, there was no collection whatsoever. Now, Rothbard continues with this. President Washington and Secretary Hamilton chose to make a fuss about Western Pennsylvania. This was a political strategy on their point. About Western Pennsylvania, they made a fuss about it precisely because in that region, there was a cadre of wealthy officials who were willing to collect taxes. Such a cadre did not even exist in the other areas of the American frontier. There was no fuss or violence against tax collectors in Kentucky, for example, and the rest of the backcountry, because there was no one willing to be a tax collector. If you think about the situation in comparison to what they did to the tax collectors in response to the Stamp Act, it's this very similar type of an approach. Now, Rothbard points out that Western PA was really just the tip of the iceberg. Pretty much everywhere else, it just was not really paid at all. And government today, whether it's state or federal, they often take this same kind of approach that Rothbard points out that Washington and Hamilton did. They make a big fuss, they make a big show of force in one area when there is widespread resistance to something, because they want to make an example out of people. They want to make sure everyone knows that they mean business. They hope that it's going to scare off people in other areas. But if the people hold firm, the people in the states can win, which is exactly what we're seeing play out before our very eyes in response to prohibition on cannabis. Over the years, they've really ramped up enforcement, but generally they focus on one area. Just before Colorado opened up their legalization a number of years ago, the Peace President administration conducted the largest series of raids around the state in state history as a warning. 6 weeks before they started their legalization, retail sales, they're basically saying, hey, we're going to come in and shut you down. But that just never happens because they run out of resources if the people and the states continue to take a stand. But anyways, let's get back to Rothbard here. Here's what he has to say. Let me pull it up on the screen. Rather than the whiskey tax rebellion being localized and swiftly put down, the true story turns out to be very different. The entire American backcountry was gripped by a nonviolent, civil disobedient refusal to pay the hated tax on whiskey. So a vast majority of the people just refused to comply. This is exactly what James Madison said needed to be done to keep the feds in check in Federalist number 46. Rothbard says no local juries could be found to convict tax delinquents. The whiskey rebellion was actually widespread and successful, for it eventually forced the federal government to repeal the excise tax. And this is, as I just mentioned, this is really the same type of strategy that was used to nullify the Stamp Act back in 1765. It was a series of protests, noncompliance, pressuring local officials to step down, even having some local officials refuse to follow the Stamp Act. There was some local courts in Maryland, for example, that said it was unconstitutional and no one was required to obey it. So it's the same approach, and it had a very positive effect. In 1765, we saw the same thing play out in response to the whiskey tax, despite the fact that the physical resistance in Western Pennsylvania melted away in the face of a large kind of George Washington-led military force. But I covered the resistance to the Stamp Act in another episode that I think you'll find interesting, the People's Nullification of the Stamp Act, which really highlights a lot of the work from Murray Rothbard as well. Now, Rothbard sums this all up like this. He said, Washington, Hamilton, and the cabinet covered up the extent of the revolution because they didn't want to advertise the extent of their failure. They knew very well that if they tried to enforce or send an army into the rest of the back country, they would have failed. Kentucky and perhaps the other areas would have seceded from the Union then and there. Both contemporary sides were happy to cover up the truth, and historians fell for the deception. And a lot of people are still repeating that propaganda. We hear it all the time. Just like George Washington, they'll shut you down. And it's not the case. It just didn't happen like that. The Whiskey Rebellion, then, Rothbard sums up, considered properly, was a victory for liberty and property rather than for federal taxation. So let's address part 2 of this objection to resistance. Now that we've kind of briefly gone over, and I think if you read Rothbard's work in a little bit more detail, you'll get a deeper understanding of that as well. But part 2 is that there was no more resistance. Once they were shut down by the feds, once Washington mustered up those troops and showed the force of the central government, we had no more resistance. This is despite the fact that James Madison in Federalist 46 said a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union is the way to stop them, using state legislative devices, disobedience by the people. And he said once this happens, plans of resistance would be coordinated amongst the states. And of course, we're told over and over that the next chance that anyone did was crushed by Abraham Lincoln. Now, First of all, there's 1798, the Alien and Sedition Acts, where Madison, along with Thomas Jefferson, called on the states to interpose and nullify in response to those hated unconstitutional acts. And here from an article by Mike Meharry, he points out that a Madison County, Kentucky militia regiment issued an ominous resolution of its own, stating, quote, "The Alien and Sedition bills are an infringement of the Constitution of natural rights, and we cannot approve or submit to them." They were ready to take a stand. He said that several thousand people gathered at an outdoor meeting protesting the acts in Lexington on August 13. They were really armed up and ready to roll. And in some ways, Breckinridge, who carried the legislation, and even Jefferson behind the scenes, we were concerned that people were a little too fired up. So they ended up mellowing out some of the language in the resolution to not create that level of a conflict at that point. But Jefferson the following year in some letters to Madison even pointed out that, like, okay, we're going to have to keep pushing on this. And if we can't get rid of it, we can't nullify it or get rid of it, it might be time for Kentucky and Virginia to leave the Union. That was his next follow-up. But anyways, a little further from this article by Mike Meharry. On November 7th, 1798, the governor of Kentucky addressed the state legislature, noting the vehement opposition to the Alien and Sedition Acts. He said Kentucky was, quote, "if not in a state of insurrection, yet utterly disaffected to the federal government." So there was resistance planned and put into motion against the Alien and Sedition Acts. It did end up being sweeping the Jeffersonians into power. And of course, he got rid of both the Alien and Sedition Acts. He stopped enforcing it, got rid of it, and then also the whiskey tax as well. But there was all kinds of opposition, non-compliance, and non-enforcement that happened against Thomas Jefferson as well. In his second term, he had this disastrous embargo, which I covered in an episode just in October of this year, the embargo of 1807 through 1809. And so once he got in power, he started doing stuff. This is just kind of repeating the maxim of don't trust anyone with power, including the people who tell you don't trust anyone with power. Don't trust the people who say a single step goes beyond the limits of the Constitution is a step too far, like Thomas Jefferson, because once they get in power, they will also do the same kind of thing. But that's a side note. But he had this horrible, disastrous embargo idea, and he tried to work on it, but there was all kinds of opposition to it. We've got New Orleans, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Connecticut, North Carolina, and elsewhere where they just were not complying. Albert Gallatin was writing saying, we can't get this thing enforced. And I covered that in some details in an episode, which will be linked to in the show notes as well. So more resistance, more non-compliance against the Jeffersonians as well. And then in response to what many people called Mr. Madison's War, the War of 1812, the states of Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island all directly refused to comply with federal requisitions of militia forces. They even had the backing of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. And there's more on this in this more recent book that just came out in the last year. I haven't read the whole thing, but there's a lot of interesting stuff in this. It came out early in 2023 by Christian Fritz, Monitoring American Federalism, the History of State Legislative Resistance. You'll get more details on the resistance and opposition to the War of 1812, which even led to people like Gouverneur Morris, one of the big government guys at the time of ratification, who was supporting the Hartford Convention of 1814, even going so far as to recommend secession as a response. Also here, a Massachusetts paper, the Salem Gazette, during that time reprinted James Madison's Federalist 46. So we see Jefferson calling for nullification of acts outside the limits of the Constitution. And then once he gets in power and he does stuff that he shouldn't be doing or the people don't like, they use his strategy against him. James Madison said the states are duty-bound to interpose in the Virginia resolutions, and in Federalist 46 recommended a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union once he's in power. And now, mind you, Madison said that a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union could be used against constitutional acts that are bad policy that you disagree with or unconstitutional ones. So the constitutionality of the declaration of war in the War of 1812, they're basically saying, hey, we're just doing what you told us to do. If we don't like the policy, we refuse to comply. And so that's what those states, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, and even basically the Supreme Court in Massachusetts were saying this is what's going on. And so this paper, the Salem Gazette, reprinted his Federalist 46 in full, in which Madison made the argument for defending states' rights against the national government in response to the national government trying to press the state militia into national service. I wish they would have included the fact that the reason that they published it is because Madison himself said use a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Then next up, as South Carolina described it to us in 1860, for, according to them, 25 years. So 25 straight years, I went to government-run school, so my math is terrible. 1835-ish through 1860, all the northern states have, quote, enacted laws which either nullify the acts of Congress or render useless any attempt to execute them. And they were referencing the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 and its follow-up in the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. That's also another one that I covered in an episode this year in September that will be linked to in the show notes as well. And here in modern times, we're seeing this play out more and more and more. One of the most prominent places, if not the most prominent one, is in response to the war on drugs in regards specifically and narrowly to the cannabis plant. We see this happening, resistance and noncompliance, states, localities, individuals, and federal. So here's how I described it in another episode. This is a 50-year history going all the way back to the early 70s of efforts by the state to nullify the feds, cities to nullify the state of California, and individuals to nullify them all. Because ultimately, it gets down to people who are willing to learn how to exercise their rights, whether the government wants them to or not. And then earlier this week, I also covered this same type of approach, James Madison's strategy, being applied by a handful of states so far. We'd like to see this expand in big ways against federal gun control. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I hope it was thought-provoking, and I hope you enjoyed watching or listening. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today, and if you want to support us getting this kind of message out to more and more people, nothing helps us do this work more every single day more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, I really appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you have an awesome weekend, and I hope to see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.